My name is Captain Callie Duffy of the United States Army. At 33 years old, I've served 3 tours in Afghanistan, but the most brutal battlefield I ever faced was my own father's retirement party. Right there, in the middle of the glittering ballroom at the Officers Club in Washington, D.C., my heart just stopped. My name wasn't on the seating chart for the head table. My stepmother, Patricia, glided over, her smile as sharp as a piece of shrapnel. "Oh, Callie, darling," she cooed, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "We had to make a few strategic adjustments to the seating. You'll be at table 12, near the kitchen. You'll be more comfortable there, with the other tactical soldiers." She emphasized the word tactical like it was a disease. My father, a 4-star general, just stood there, his eyes avoiding mine, and said the one sentence that froze my soul. "It's about relationships, Callie. You have to understand." They had no idea that my husband, Marcus, the man they always dismissed, was watching silently from the edge of the room. And he was already preparing a final parade of his own. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had your sacrifices dismissed by your own family. And get ready for a story about a different kind of justice. One that doesn't come from rank, but from truth. The air in the Fort McNair ballroom was thick with the smell of power, a heavy blend of expensive perfume, old leather, and money. As Marcus and I stepped through the grand archway, the sound washed over us. The delicate chime of crystal champagne flutes, the low murmur of conversations about multi-billion-dollar defense contracts, and the distant, formal strains of a string quartet. All around us, men and women stood ramrod straight in their dress blue and mess dress uniforms, their chests gleaming with medals that told stories of service and sacrifice. I straightened my own uniform jacket, the familiar weight of it settling on my shoulders like a second skin. A quiet pride swelled in my chest. This uniform, these people, this world of service. It represented everything I believed in. It was my identity, earned with sweat and blood, not given. Then I saw him. My father, General Robert Duffy, stood near the towering ice sculpture of an eagle, his laughter booming across the room. His hand rested proudly on the shoulder of my stepsister, Jessica. The gesture wasn't just fatherly, it was proprietary, a king presenting his chosen heir. A familiar, cold knot began to form in my stomach. Marcus felt me tense, his hand finding mine and giving it a gentle squeeze. He didn't say a word, but he didn't need to. His touch was a silent anchor, a quiet, "I'm here." Our arrival did not go unnoticed for long. Patricia detached herself from a circle of senators' wives and descended upon us. She offered a hug that was pure performance. Her hands barely grazed my shoulders, and I could feel a chill emanating from her Chanel suit. "Callie, you're late," she said, her voice a polished weapon. "Jessica has been here for an hour already, networking with the senators." Her eyes did a quick, dismissive scan of my uniform. "You look so regulation." In Patricia's world, that was the ultimate insult. It meant I lacked the political savvy, the DC glamour that she and Jessica valued above all else. Speaking of Jessica, she turned from her conversation, a condescending smile playing on her lips. She was a vision in a blood-red Oscar de la Renta gown, a stark contrast to my practical, honorable green. "Callie, hi," she said, her tone implying surprise. "I almost thought you'd be stuck on some training field and couldn't make it." The contrast between us had never been sharper. She was the political princess, the lobbyist who wielded influence in hushed backrooms. I was the soldier, the commander who led from the front in dusty, dangerous places. To my family, it was obvious which role they valued more. I ignored the sting of their words and walked toward the ornate seating chart displayed on a velvet-draped easel. I scanned the list for my name under the heading, Head Table. Duffy. There was General Robert Duffy, Patricia Duffy, Jessica Morrison. But no Captain Callie Duffy. I read the list again, slower this time, my mind refusing to process the omission. It felt like the blood was draining from my face. The room began to tilt, the cheerful music distorting into a low buzz in my ears. "Ah, Callie, there you are." Patricia's voice cut through my shock. She was standing beside me, a look of feigned sympathy on her face. I was just about to find you. We had to make a last-minute strategic adjustment. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger down the list, past the tables of colonels and dignitaries, all the way to the bottom. You're at table 12. It's a much better fit. I just stared at her, speechless. A better fit? You know how these things are, she continued, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. General Thompson needed to be next to the primary donor, and Senator Clark wanted to discuss the budget with Jessica. She gestured vaguely toward the back of the massive room, near the swinging doors that led to the kitchen. You'll be much more comfortable over there. It's all captains, sergeants. You know, the people who actually work in the field. She delivered the line with a saccharine smile, the insult wrapped in a compliment so twisted it made me feel sick. She had turned my service, my sacrifice, into something common, something to be seated next to the clatter of the kitchen staff. Waiters were already starting to bring out the first course to the head tables, carrying silver platters laden with steaming lobster tails and perfectly carved beef Wellington. I glanced towards table 12. The plates set there were starkly different. A single pale-looking chicken breast next to a scoop of mashed potatoes. The message was as clear as the crystal glasses on the head table. We were different classes of people. I needed to hear it from him. I pushed through the crowd, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I found my father accepting congratulations from another general. I waited until he was finished. Dad, I said, my voice barely a whisper. There must be a mistake with the seating. He looked at me, and for a split second I saw a flicker of guilt in his eyes before it was extinguished by irritation. He became General Duffy again. Patricia handled the arrangements, he said, his tone clipped and dismissive. You know how complicated these events are. He placed a hand on my shoulder, not in a gesture of comfort, but of control, a move designed to pacify and dismiss me. It felt heavy, ghoulish. Don't make a scene, Callie, this is my night. And there it was, the final devastating blow. This is my night. My pain, my humiliation, was an inconvenience to his image. In that moment, he wasn't my father, he was my commanding officer giving me a direct, unspoken order. An order to stand down, an order to accept my designated inferior position, an order to swallow my humiliation and melt into the background. It was a crueler command than any I had ever received on the battlefield. I felt my spirit snap to attention, my voice silenced not by respect, but by the sheer, crushing weight of his betrayal. Sitting at table 12 felt like being exiled to a distant, forgotten island. From my vantage point, I could see the whole glittering spectacle of the party, but I wasn't a part of it. I watched my father work the room, a master of his universe. He moved from table to table, a hand on this person's back, a shared laugh with that one. He was introducing Jessica to everyone who mattered, presenting her as his crowning achievement. He passed our table twice. The first time, his eyes swept over us, a brief, impersonal flicker, as if we were part of the catering staff. The second time, he didn't even look in our direction. He was a ship sailing past my island, not even noticing the castaway waving from the shore. Seeing him glide past me like that, so effortlessly invisible, was like a key turning in a lock, opening a door to a long, dark hallway of memories. It pulled me back to my graduation day at West Point. The sky over the Hudson River was a brilliant, cloudless blue. Cadets in their full-dress gray uniforms filled the field, a sea of discipline and hope. My father was there, but he wasn't really there. He spent most of the ceremony pacing in the back, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice a low, urgent murmur about some situation at the Pentagon. When my name was called and I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, I saw him in the stands. He offered a polite, perfunctory clap, the kind you give at a golf tournament. All around him, other parents were on their feet, cheering, whistling, some of them openly weeping with pride as they hugged their sons and daughters. I told myself he had important, nation-saving business to attend to. It was the excuse I had used my entire life. But deep down, in that quiet place where truth lives, I knew it was just an excuse. He wasn't absent because he was a general. He was absent because he was my father. A different memory surfaced, sharp and bitter. It was Christmas, the year I turned 28, just 2 weeks after I'd returned from a brutal tour in Iraq. The whole family was gathered at my father's house in Georgetown, the air filled with the scent of pine needles and Patricia's expensive candles. She and Jessica held court in the living room, recounting every detail of a successful lobbying deal they had closed for a defense contractor. They talked about lavish parties, yacht trips, and the political gamesmanship of DC with breathless excitement. I tried to join the conversation, tried to share something real. I talked about the oppressive 120-degree heat in Fallujah, about the grit of my soldiers, about the constant gnawing tension of living under threat. Patricia cut me off mid-sentence, her wine glass paused halfway to her lips. "Oh, darling, let's not discuss such heavy things at dinner." Her voice was smooth, but the message was clear. My reality was unpleasant, an unwelcome intrusion into their curated world. My father, ever the diplomat, chimed in to support her. "That's your job, Callie. We all have our battles to fight." He said it with a casual wave of his hand, as if negotiating a budget amendment was the same as dodging an IED. The comparison was so insulting, so profoundly ignorant, it stole the air from my lungs. I spent the rest of the dinner in silence, a ghost at my own family's table. But the memory that cut the deepest, the one that still felt like an open wound, was from Afghanistan. We had been ambushed in a narrow valley, a chaotic storm of dust and bullets. We fought them off, but we lost a good man. Private First Class Evans, a 19-year-old kid from a small town in Oklahoma with a goofy smile and a picture of his high school sweetheart taped inside his helmet. He'd bled out in my arms. Before we deployed, I'd met his mother. She'd clutched my hand, her eyes filled with a mother's terror. And I had promised her I would take care of her boy. That night, shattered and hollowed out, I called my father. I just needed to hear his voice. I needed some small piece of comfort from the one man who was supposed to be my rock. He answered on the third ring. I could hear the thwack of a golf club hitting a ball in the background. He was at a charity tournament. "I'm a bit tied up, Callie. Is it important?" His voice was impatient, distracted. The casualness of his question was like a slap in the face. My world had just ended, and he was asking if it was important. "No, sir," I whispered. "It's nothing." I hung up the phone. That night, I stayed awake until dawn, writing a long handwritten letter to PFC Evans's mother, telling her about her son's courage, about how he'd made everyone laugh, about how he was a hero. In that moment of profound grief, I realized I found more humanity, more connection, more family in the letters I wrote to the parents of my fallen soldiers than I had ever found with my own father. A slight movement at my table brought me back to the present. The man sitting across from me, a first sergeant with a hard face and scars etched into the back of his hands, caught my eye. His gaze dropped for a fraction of a second to my chest, to the one award that truly mattered among soldiers, the Combat Infantryman Badge. It's a simple silver and blue rectangle, but it says everything. It says you've been there. It says you've walked the walk. He didn't say a word. He just gave me a short, almost imperceptible nod. But his eyes said it all. "I know where you've been. I know what you've done. I see you." That small silent gesture of recognition from a complete stranger meant more to me than 1,000 empty compliments from my father about Jessica's latest political victory. It was a balm on my wounded soul, but it was also salt. It amplified the ache in my heart with a single, burning question. Why could this stranger see me so clearly when my own father looked right through me? Just then, the string quartet quieted. A voice came over the sound system, formal and crisp. "Ladies and gentlemen, please direct your attention to the stage for a special address from our guest of honor, General Robert Duffy." A spotlight cut through the dim ballroom, illuminating the podium. My father was making his way to the stage. I watched him, and despite everything, a stupid, stubborn little flicker of hope ignited in my chest. The part of me that was still a little girl wanting her dad's approval whispered, "Maybe now. Maybe he'll say something now." I took a slow, deep breath, holding on to that last fragile thread of hope as he tapped the microphone. When my father, General Duffy, stepped onto the stage, a hush fell over the entire ballroom. The spotlight found him, glinting off the rows of medals and ribbons on his chest. a lifetime of service distilled into colorful metal. Under the table, Marcus's hand tightened around mine. He knew what I was thinking, what that small, foolish part of me was hoping for. The little girl inside me, the one who had spent a lifetime chasing a shadow, whispered, "Maybe this time it will be different. Maybe the seating chart was just Patricia's mistake." I held my breath as my father approached the podium. He tapped the microphone, the sound echoing in the silent room. He began with the standard acknowledgments, his voice resonant and commanding, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He thanked his colleagues, his mentors, the institution of the Army itself. My heart began to beat a little faster when he finally said, "And now, I want to talk about family, the bedrock of all my success." This was it. I leaned forward slightly in my chair, a knot of tension and fragile hope tightening in my stomach. "I want to thank my wonderful wife, Patricia," he boomed, and Patricia stood to give a graceful, queenly wave to the applauding room. His gaze softened. "And I cannot express the boundless pride I have for Jessica." His voice, when he spoke her name, became warmer, more intimate. It was a tone I hadn't heard him use in years, if ever, when speaking about me. "This young woman came to Washington and conquered it with her intellect and her grit. She is the very picture of a new generation of leader." He then launched into an anecdote, a story meant to illustrate her supposed courage. He spoke of a tense budget negotiation, a difficult Senate hearing where Jessica had to defend a controversial spending package. "She stood her ground against 3 senior senators," my father declared, his chest puffing out. "She didn't flinch. She fought for what she believed in. That, ladies and gentlemen, is courage in the boardroom." The room erupted in laughter and another round of applause, and I just sat there, at table 12, feeling the acid of his words burn through my chest. Boardroom courage. He was comparing her political maneuvering, her lobbying for a defense contract, to actual courage. The courage of a soldier facing down enemy fire. The courage of PFC Evans from Oklahoma. The absurdity of it was so profound, so deeply insulting, it was like a physical blow. He was celebrating her game in front of a room full of people who knew the real cost of a fight, and in front of his own daughter, a soldier who wore the scars of that fight. After the applause for Jessica died down, I still waited. The hope was gone now, replaced by a cold, dreadful certainty. But I waited nonetheless. There had to be something, a brief mention, a nod, a single sentence. But no. He moved on. He thanked the Army Band. He thanked the club's staff for their excellent service, and then he raised his glass. "Thank you all for coming." And that was it. It was over. My name was never spoken. My 3 tours in Afghanistan, the Bronze Star, the Combat Infantryman Badge, the soldiers I had led, the friends I had buried, none of it existed in the official history of his life. In his legacy, I was not his daughter. I was a blank space, an inconvenient truth that had been neatly omitted. The feeling that washed over me wasn't anger. It wasn't even sadness. It was a profound, terrifying emptiness. It felt as if my entire life had just been erased with a single, dismissive wave of his hand. If you've ever been made to feel invisible by the one person who should see you the most, please support this story with a like. And if you know what this feeling is like, comment, "I see you" below. For everyone who deserves to be seen. Just when I thought the public humiliation was complete, that the bottom had been reached, he held up a hand to quiet the room again. "And before I go," he said with a broad smile, "I have one final, important announcement." The room quieted in anticipation. He began to speak about a project dear to his heart, the Duffy Veteran Support Fund, a foundation he had established years ago. "My position on the board of directors requires a worthy successor," he announced, "someone with the strategic vision to lead the fund into a new era." My heart, which I thought had stopped feeling anything, gave a painful lurch. This was it. The position he had promised me just 6 months ago over a stiff dinner. He'd said my field experience, my direct connection to the soldiers who needed help, would be invaluable. He had looked me in the eye and said it was my legacy too. I looked at him on that stage, a triumphant smile spreading across his face as he scanned the room. For one insane second, I thought this was his plan all along. A dramatic reveal. A way to finally acknowledge me. But then his eyes landed on Jessica, and his smile widened. I am absolutely thrilled to announce, he declared, his voice booming with pride, that Jessica Morrison will be taking on this vital role. The room exploded. The applause was deafening, a physical force that pressed down on me. I saw Patricia dabbing a tear from her eye, Jessica looking humble and powerful all at once. I didn't feel the slap this time. I didn't feel the acid. I felt nothing at all. I was just sitting there, a ghost in a uniform, a nameless soldier in a stolen legacy. As the ballroom stood in thunderous applause for Jessica, I felt myself begin to drift. The sound was a distant roar, the glittering lights blurred into meaningless streaks. I was sinking into the cold, silent void that my father's speech had created for me. Then, through the numbness, I felt a warmth spread across my hand. Marcus. His hand was wrapped around mine, his grip firm and steady. It wasn't a sympathetic squeeze, it was an anchor holding me fast in a storm. I looked at him and his eyes met mine. There was no pity in his gaze, none of the awkward sorrow I saw on the faces of the other soldiers at our table. There was only a deep, unwavering understanding. And beneath it, a slow-burning fire of anger on my behalf. He leaned in close, his voice a low whisper meant only for me, easily cutting through the noise. You don't have to be okay, Callie. The words were so simple, but they were everything I needed to hear. He wasn't telling me to be strong, or to brush it off, or to rise above it. He was giving me permission to be broken, and letting me know he was there to catch the pieces. That quiet permission was a greater act of love than any grand gesture my father had ever made. He held my gaze, his thumb gently stroking the back of my hand. I was just remembering why I married a soldier, he said, his voice solid and sure. It wasn't for the uniform or the rank. It was for the night you came back from Kandahar, exhausted to the bone, and you still stayed up until 3 a.m, calling every single family in your platoon just to tell them their kid was safe. That's leadership. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible jerk of his chin toward the head table, where my father was beaming at Jessica. Those people up there, they don't know a thing about it. His words were like a cool drink of water on a scorched earth soul. He was reminding me of who I was, not as my father's daughter, but as myself. He was reminding me of a value system my family would never comprehend. I thought back to our wedding day. It was a small, simple ceremony at a justice of the peace, nothing like the grand affair Patricia had wanted. The most controversial part for my family was when Marcus insisted on taking my last name. I remember my father pulling him aside at the small reception we held afterward. "Duffy, why would you take her name, son?" he'd asked, a smirk playing on his lips. Marcus, in his quiet, unassuming way, had looked the 4-star general right in the eye. "Because the name Duffy, through Callie," he had said, "represents the kind of service I admire." My father had let out a short, scoffing laugh and clapped him on the shoulder, dismissing the act as a sign of weakness, of a man who wasn't ambitious enough. My family had never understood him. They saw his quiet nature as a lack of drive, his humility as a failure to grasp for power. They saw a simple IT technician, a man utterly out of his depth in their world of power brokers and political climbers. Throughout the dinner service, Marcus's phone, resting face down on the table, kept vibrating. Each time, a soft blue light would pulse from under its edges. He'd glance at it quickly, his expression unreadable, and then slip it back into his pocket. Patricia, making her rounds, happened to pass our table during one of these moments. She saw the screen light up and gave a tinkling, condescending laugh. "Busy night at the computer shop, Marcus?" she'd asked, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. He just offered her a polite smile, a smile that I was beginning to realize was a carefully constructed mask. "You could say that," he'd replied smoothly. Once, as he was putting it away, I caught a glimpse of a notification on his lock screen. It was from an encrypted app I didn't recognize. The text was brief, almost coded. "Confirmation received. Package is ready for delivery." My first instinct was a flicker of unease. What package? But that feeling was quickly replaced by a wave of intense curiosity. It was a piece of a puzzle I didn't know existed, and it planted a tiny seed of hope in the barren ground of my despair. Something was happening beneath the surface, something my family, in all their arrogant certainty, couldn't see. The final announcements began. My father returned to the podium to formally announce the new partnerships for the fund. When he mentioned a foundational grant of $5 million from a corporation called Aegis Dynamics, I felt Marcus's entire body go rigid beside me. His hand, still in mine, felt like stone. I saw a muscle jump in his jaw. And then came the final blow, the announcement that Jessica Morrison would be taking the seat on the board. The polite applause started up again, but Marcus was already moving. He didn't just stand up. He rose with a sudden sharp energy that was completely out of character. He was on his feet before the applause had even peaked. "I have to make a call," he said. His voice had lost all of its earlier warmth. It was cold, sharp, and dangerously calm. "This changes everything." He turned and walked away from the table, not with his usual easygoing gait, but with a brisk, determined stride. He wasn't just leaving the room. He was heading for a purpose. He walked like a soldier heading into a fight. I watched his back, straight and resolute, as he disappeared through the ballroom doors. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a wild drumbeat of confusion, fear, and a strange, electrifying hope. I had no idea what he was about to do, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The quiet, unassuming man my family had dismissed for years was about to do something they would never, ever forget. I couldn't just sit there anymore, not for one more second. My father's words, Jessica's triumphant smile, the thunderous applause from a room that didn't know the truth, it all coalesced into a single, unbearable weight pressing down on me. It felt like a verdict being read, a final judgment on my worthlessness. The blood in my veins wasn't just warm anymore, it was boiling. It wasn't simple anger, it was the volcanic eruption of a lifetime of betrayal, a feeling that went bone deep. I stood up. The scraping of my chair against the polished floor sounded impossibly loud in the suddenly quiet space around me. My body moved before my mind could object, carried forward by a current of pure, undiluted indignation. I walked past the round tables, a soldier on a new kind of mission. The low hum of conversation faltered and died as I approached the head table. 100 pairs of eyes followed my progress. I felt like a lone infantryman advancing across open ground directly into the enemy's stronghold. I didn't stop until I was standing directly behind my father's chair. He was still smiling, accepting congratulations from a nearby senator. "General," I said. My voice didn't shake. It was as cold and clear as ice. "We need to talk." He turned, and the smile vanished from his face, replaced by a flash of pure annoyance. "Callie, go back to your seat. Don't make a scene." His voice was low, but it was an order, the same tone he'd use on a disobedient private. Patricia leaned forward, her face a mask of outrage. "What do you think you're doing?" she hissed, her voice like scraping metal. "You are embarrassing this entire family." Jessica just sat there, a smug little smirk on her face, leaning back in her chair to enjoy the show. I ignored them both. My focus was a laser beam, locked on my father. "You promised me that position," I said, my voice dangerously level. "You told me my experience was invaluable." My father's eyes darted away, unable to meet mine. He looked at the tablecloth, at his water glass, anywhere but at me. "The situation has changed, Callie. Strategy requires flexibility." The corporate speak, the empty jargon, was like gasoline on a fire. "Strategy?" I shot back, my voice rising slightly. "Or is it convenience?" The word hung in the air between us, heavy and sharp. The tension at the table was thick enough to cut with a knife. Seeing my father falter, Jessica decided to step in, her voice dripping with condescension. "Managing a $5 million fund requires a little more than battlefield courage, Callie," she said, examining her perfectly manicured nails. "It requires connections." Her words were a direct slap, a dismissal of everything I was. "Connections?" I repeated, my voice now a low growl. I turned my full attention to her. "I lead soldiers, Jessica. I have held men in my arms as they bled out on foreign soil." I have personally bandaged wounds under enemy fire. I have written letters to mothers whose sons are never coming home. What in God's name is more real than that? A dead silence fell over the room. You could have heard a pin drop. My father's face was now a deep, mottled red, a mixture of fury and acute public shame. The little girl in me who had always been so afraid of his anger was gone. I just didn't care anymore. He finally found his voice, and when he did, it was a roar. "That's enough," he bellowed, slamming his fist on the table, making the crystal glasses jump. "You have always been a disappointment. Military police, get her out of here." The moment the words, military police, left his mouth, something inside me shattered for the final time. It was the ultimate betrayal. He wasn't just disowning me, he was classifying me as a threat, an enemy to be neutralized. Two uniformed MPs, who had been standing discreetly by the entrance, began to make their way toward me. They looked profoundly uncomfortable, their faces apologetic, but they had their orders. A 4-star general had spoken. As they reached me, one on each side, Patricia delivered a final, venomous blow. She just never could accept her own limitations, she said to the senator sitting beside her, just loud enough for me to hear. Jessica added her own parting shot, a smug little twist of the knife. Some people are born to be generals, others are just soldiers. The MPs gently took my arms. The humiliation was absolute, a searing hot brand on my soul. I was being escorted out of my own father's retirement party like a common criminal. My career, my reputation, my entire life felt like it was crumbling to dust in that long, silent walk across the ballroom floor. But just as they were about to guide me through the doors, a voice cut through the suffocating silence. It was calm, steady, and radiated an authority that stopped everyone in their tracks. "That won't be necessary." Marcus was back. Marcus placed a steadying hand on my shoulder, a silent anchor in my personal storm, before turning his attention to the two military policemen. "Thank you, gentlemen," he said, his voice calm and firm, projecting a sudden authority. "We can take it from here." He then turned to face my father. "But before we go, General," he said, his tone respectful but laced with cold steel, "I just have one question. Do you actually know who you're accepting money from?" The question hung in the air, a grenade with the pin pulled, detonating the smug atmosphere and shifting the room's dynamic in a heartbeat. Near the head table, Admiral Chen, the chairman of the funds board and a man whose integrity was legendary, narrowed his eyes. He gave the MPs a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a silent countermand to a 4-star general's order. "Let the boys speak," he commanded quietly, his voice a rumble that carried more weight than my father's bellowing. Patricia, recovering from the shock, let out a derisive snort, a last gasp of her perceived superiority. "And what would an IT technician know about defense contractors?" she sneered. Marcus ignored her completely. It was a dismissal so total it was more insulting than any retort. It was as if she didn't exist. He walked away from me, moving with that same newfound purpose, and stepped onto the stage. He took the microphone with a natural ease, as if born to it. The ballroom, which had been buzzing with shocked whispers, fell silent again. This was a new kind of silence, one of intense, hungry anticipation. "Good evening," Marcus began, his voice amplified, filling every corner of the vast space. It was the same voice that read to me at night, now holding a timbre of absolute control. "I'd like to tell you all a brief story about your new benefactor, the Aegis Dynamics Corporation." I watched, utterly stunned, my humiliation forgotten, replaced by a profound dislocation. Who was this man? This wasn't the Marcus who fixed my laptop and made quiet jokes in the kitchen. This was someone else, someone with a spine of pure steel and a strategist's mind. Aegis was founded a few years ago, he continued, by a man who got tired of watching his wife, an army officer, spend her own money on better armor plates for her soldiers. He got tired of hearing her stories about faulty radio equipment in the middle of a firefight, of the sheer terror in a young soldier's voice going silent at the worst possible moment. Marcus paused, and his eyes found mine across the room. a silent acknowledgement that stripped me bare. Sound familiar, Callie? My heart didn't just stop. It felt like it dropped out of my chest. Those were my words, my stories, my private griefs, whispered to him late at night when the weight of command was too heavy. He had been listening, not just with sympathy, but with purpose. That founder, Marcus went on, his voice ringing with a conviction that sent a shiver down my spine, believes that soldiers like his wife, the ones doing the actual fighting, deserve a hell of a lot more than a seat by the kitchen. My father's furious expression crumbled, replaced by horrified confusion. So, when he agreed to fund this foundation, he insisted on a few very specific clauses in the contract. Marcus pulled out his phone, the screen glowing in the dim light. He swiped once, deliberately. Allow me to read from Section 7, Subsection 3 of the agreement you signed, General. The appointment to the Board of Directors must give priority to candidates with direct combat command experience within the last 5 years. A low murmur rippled through the audience. It was the sound of careers being reevaluated, alliances shifting. I saw Brigadier General Thompson, who'd clapped my father's back moments earlier, now staring at him with cold calculation. And Subsection 4, Marcus continued, his voice relentless. The fund's programs must focus on providing direct support to active duty soldiers at the company and non-commissioned officer level. He looked up from his phone, his gaze sweeping the room. He even has a new armor system in development, a project inspired by her stories of bringing her people home. The internal code name is Guardian Angel. The triumphant look on Jessica's face had completely vanished. Her composure was cracking, revealing raw panic. My father was stammering now, his authority draining away. I don't recall those specific clauses. The paperwork was extensive. From the head table, Admiral Chen's voice cut through the tension like a knife, cold and precise. Robert, did you review the final contract with the fund's legal counsel? My father's head snapped toward Patricia, a desperate, cornered look in his eyes. Patricia said Jessica reviewed it. Every head at the head table, and dozens more around the room, swiveled to face Jessica. She looked ill, her face ashen. Her eyes darted, searching for an ally, but found only stony faces. I just skimmed the financial sections, she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. The numbers were solid. Her arrogance, her carelessness, her complete dismissal of the details had just created a fatal breach. Have you ever watched someone you love finally show the world how powerful they truly are? If you have, hit the like button for Marcus. And in the comments, tell us who your guardian angel is. That quiet, strong person who always has your back. Marcus let the weight of her admission settle over the room for a long, painful moment. He let the silence stretch, amplifying her incompetence before delivering the final blow. And the most important clause of all, General. The one that protects the donor's intent above all else. Section 12. Subsection 1. Any public announcement regarding board appointments made without the express written consent of the donor constitutes a material breach of this contract. Marcus looked directly at my father, his voice dropping to a cold, clear tone that sealed their fate. General, you just breached your contract, live, on this stage, in front of everyone. The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier than any silence I'd known, even in the Afghan night. It was the silence of a perfectly executed ambush, the silence of a trap springing shut. And in that silence, for the first time all night, I felt myself breathe. The crushing silence was shattered by Patricia's shriek. It was a raw, ugly sound that clawed at the air. She lunged for the nearest microphone on the head table, her perfectly manicured fingers wrapping around it like a vulture's talons. How dare you, she screeched, her voice cracking with fury. You're nothing but a pathetic little computer technician. You've deceived us all. Her wild eyes then found me, and she pointed a trembling, red-nailed finger in my direction. This is all your fault. You never had any ambition, content to play in the mud overseas while Jessica was shaping national policy. You are a disgrace. Her toxic words echoed through the ballroom, but for the first time, they didn't penetrate my armor. They couldn't hurt me anymore. They were just the desperate, dying rattles of a queen whose castle was crumbling around her, exposing the petty, hollow woman she truly was. Marcus calmly walked over and gently took the microphone from her grasp. He looked at her with an expression not of anger, but of something close to pity, before his gaze softened as it landed on me. "You're right about one thing," he said, his voice now a warm counterpoint to her hysteria. "I am incredibly proud of my warrior wife." He then turned back to the stunned audience. "Perhaps it's time I properly introduced myself." He took a deep, centering breath. "My name is Marcus Duffy." "Yes," he affirmed as a fresh wave of gasps spread through the room. "I took my wife's last name when we were married." He let that sink in, knowing full well the implications in this world of patriarchal tradition. "Her father laughed at me for it," Marcus continued, his voice steady. "He thought it was a sign of weakness, of a man who wasn't man enough to have his wife take his name. But I did it because I wanted to carry the name of the only Duffy I knew who truly understood the meaning of service." He paused, and for a heart-stopping moment, he told them the story he'd only ever told me. He spoke of my return from Kandahar, exhausted and haunted, and how he'd wake in the dead of night to find me in the living room, staring at the wall. My hands clenched. He told them how he'd hold me while I relived firefights in my sleep, screaming out the names of my soldiers. "I realized then," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "that the war doesn't end when a soldier comes home, and I knew I had to do something." My father finally found his voice, a weak, trembling version of its former authority. What is this game you're playing, Marcus?" Marcus looked straight into his father-in-law's eyes. "I'm not playing a game, General. I'm telling the truth. The truth you were never bothered to ask about." He let a beat of silence hang in the air, a silent indictment of their willful ignorance. "You all assumed I was unsuccessful because I didn't brag about my work, because I drive a 10-year-old Ford, because I wear suits from J. Crew instead of Armani. You wrote a story about me based on your own shallow prejudices, and you never once thought to see if it was true." He stood taller, the quiet humility he always wore falling away to reveal the formidable man beneath. And then, he delivered the final, fatal shot, his voice ringing with the clear, undeniable force of truth. "My name is Marcus Duffy, and I am the founder and CEO of Aegis Dynamics Corporation." If Patricia's shriek had cracked the silence, Marcus's statement shattered it into a million pieces. The ballroom erupted. It was a chaotic explosion of sound. Gasps, frantic whispers, the scraping of chairs as people turned to stare at our family's implosion. Patricia was babbling, her words nonsensical. My father physically sagged in his chair, as if the strings holding him upright had been cut. He looked shrunken, defeated, a decade older in the span of 10 minutes. Jessica, the master strategist, whipped out her phone, her hands shaking so violently she could barely unlock it. But it was too late. Her phone began to ring, its cheerful custom ringtone a macabre counterpoint to the unfolding disaster. The call was on speaker, and we could all hear the enraged voice of a man bellowing through the tiny speaker. "Jessica, what the hell did you do? My phone is blowing up. The live stream is everywhere." It was the managing partner of her lobbying firm. Her career, built on a foundation of ruthless calculation and carefully curated connections, was over. Finished. Live on the internet. Marcus raised a hand, and like a conductor commanding an orchestra, the room gradually fell silent again. "Due to this flagrant breach of contract," he announced, his voice now devoid of all emotion, cold and final as a judge's gavel, "Aegis Dynamics is hereby officially withdrawing its entire $5 million funding commitment, effective immediately." He didn't shout. He didn't need to. Every word was a nail in the coffin of my father's legacy. The finality of Marcus's words echoed in the cavernous silence. He stood on the stage, not as an avenger, but as a restorer of order. His eyes scanned the room before they found me, and a small, genuine smile touched his lips. "But the commitment Aegis Dynamics has to our soldiers," he said, his voice resonating with a new warmth, "that remains unchanged." He let that statement settle, a promise in the wake of the destruction. "Therefore, tonight I am proud to announce the formation of a new fund. A fund that will be governed by people who actually understand what soldiers need on the ground, not by lobbyists in corner offices. His smile widened as he looked at me, a private message sent across a public space. A fund that will prioritize emergency grants, family support, and immediate mental health access. A fund that answers the phone in the middle of the night. He paused, letting the weight of that promise fill the room. I am honored to introduce the Captain Callie Duffy Soldier Support Fund, with an initial endowment of $5 million. This time the sound that erupted was different. It wasn't the polite, calculated applause from before. This was a roar. A genuine, thunderous ovation that started low and rolled through the room like a shockwave. It wasn't a sound of approval, it was a sound of solidarity. A gut-level cry of support that came not from the polished marble of the head table, but from the forgotten corner of table 12. From all the other tables filled with the captains, sergeants, and soldiers who had been relegated to the back of the room. The men and women at my table, the so-called tactical soldiers, were the first on their feet. Their chairs scraped against the floor as they rose in unison. The first sergeant, the one with the scarred hands and knowing eyes, didn't just clap. He stood at attention for a brief second before rendering a sharp, respectful nod in my direction. His weathered face was stoic, but his eyes conveyed everything. We see you. We know you. Then, one by one, like a forest rising, soldiers from the other tables got to their feet. They weren't clapping for Marcus, or for the $5 million. I understood with a clarity that brought a hot sting to my eyes that they were clapping for me. For one of their own. Their applause was a living thing, a shield, a validation that wrapped around me and began to heal the fresh, gaping wounds my own family had just inflicted. Then, something extraordinary happened, a moment that shifted the very foundations of that room. Admiral Chen, a legend in the Navy, a man whose career was built on honor, not politics, walked purposefully onto the stage. He shook Marcus's hand firmly, a silent acknowledgement between two powerful men. Then he turned and faced me. Someone handed him a microphone. Captain Duffy, he said, his voice, accustomed to commanding fleets across oceans, was filled with a quiet, profound respect that commanded more attention than my father's booming commands ever had. If you'll have me, it would be my distinct honor to serve on the board of directors for your new fund. That was it. That was the moment the dam inside me broke. To be publicly acknowledged, to be offered service by a man of his stature. It was more than I could have ever dreamed of. It was the highest form of recognition, coming not from the father whose approval I'd craved my entire life, but from a fellow warrior who saw me for who I was, not what I represented in his political games. Meanwhile, a scene of utter chaos was unfolding at the head table. It was like watching a shipwreck in slow motion. Several generals and senators who had been laughing and backslapping with my father an hour earlier were now scurrying for the exits, their aides trailing behind them like pilot fish deserting a dying shark. They didn't want the stench of this scandal clinging to them in the morning papers. Patricia was openly weeping, not the silent, dignified tears of grief, but the shrill, hiccuping sobs of a woman who had just lost her audience. She was tugging at my father's sleeve, her voice a desperate whine. But he was unresponsive. He just sat there, motionless, a hollowed-out man in a decorated uniform, his eyes empty and fixed on some distant point in his shattered future. The legacy he had spent 40 years building, this grand final parade, had been utterly destroyed in less than 15 minutes. It was a structure built on the hollow foundations of power and connections. And when those foundations crumbled, all that remained was rubble. His legacy was dead. And mine had just been born. Marcus walked down from the stage, the applause finally beginning to subside into a warm buzz of conversation. He navigated through the well-wishers and the stunned onlookers and came directly to me. He didn't say a word. He just wrapped his arms around me and held me tight. I buried my face in the crisp fabric of his dress uniform, inhaling the familiar scent of starch and his cologne. And for a moment, the entire chaotic room faded into a dull, distant hum. In that embrace, I wasn't an officer or the head of a new fund. I was just Callie, and I was safe. As people began to approach, offering handshakes and words of congratulations, he leaned in and whispered in my ear, his voice for me and me alone. I want you to be the founding chairwoman of the fund, Callie. It's yours. You've earned it. The tears that had been welling in my eyes finally fell, but they weren't tears of pain or humiliation. They were tears of profound relief, of overwhelming gratitude that felt like a cleansing rain. For the first time in my entire life, standing in a room full of the military elite, I didn't feel the crushing need to prove myself. I wasn't fighting for a seat at a table where I was never wanted. I had been seen. Not as a general's daughter, a strategic asset, or a tactical inconvenience, but as Captain Callie Duffy, a soldier. And that was more than enough. The days that followed the retirement party were a blur of digital chaos. Someone in the ballroom, likely one of the soldiers from the back tables, had recorded the entire confrontation, from my walk to the head table to Marcus's final, devastating announcement. The video went viral. Not in the mainstream, celebrity gossip kind of way, but in the tight-knit, fiercely loyal world of the U.S. military. It exploded across the Our Army subreddit, was shared thousands of times in private veteran Facebook groups, and was dissected on military forums with a mixture of outrage and dark humor. My father, once a respected four-star general, became an internet meme overnight. They called him General Strategic, plastering his face on images with captions like, "Promotes family, forgets daughter," and "Expert in strategic seating, not contracts." It was brutal, swift, and utterly humiliating. Patricia and Jessica were flayed online, their social media accounts flooded with comments calling them out for their arrogance and disrespect. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Jessica's lobbying firm, whose reputation was built on its close ties to the military, fired her for gross misconduct, causing severe reputational damage. The Department of Defense, seeking to avoid a formal investigation and further scandal, quietly informed my father that his immediate and voluntary retirement was expected. His grand ceremony, meant to be the capstone of his career, had become its tombstone. While their world imploded, mine began to expand in ways I could never have imagined. The Captain Callie Duffy Soldier Support Fund was inundated with support. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in small donations poured in from veterans, active duty soldiers, and even ordinary American citizens who had seen the video. My story, it turned out, had struck a raw nerve within the community. The deep-seated feeling of being misunderstood and dismissed by a leadership class that was increasingly disconnected from the realities of the field. Life settled into a new, demanding rhythm. By day, I was still Captain Duffy, leading my soldiers, running drills, and doing the job I loved. By night and on weekends, I was the chairwoman of the fund, working with Marcus and our new board, including the formidable Admiral Chen, to build an organization that made a real difference. I refused to leave the Army. "I'm a soldier," I told Marcus one evening as we reviewed grant applications. "It's who I am." He just smiled, that quiet, knowing smile of his. "I know," he said. About 6 weeks after the party, the phone call I had been both dreading and expecting finally came. It was my father. His voice on the other end of the line was thin, weary, stripped of all its former command and authority. It was the voice of an old man. He told me Patricia had left him. Their social circle had evaporated, and without the power and prestige, there was nothing left to hold them together. He didn't apologize. He didn't even acknowledge what he had done. Instead, he launched into a long, rambling monologue about his 40 years of service, about his sacrifices for the country, about how he didn't deserve to be treated this way. It was a performance of self-pity, and he was seeking an audience of one. I listened in silence, my hand resting on my desk. I waited for the old familiar anger to rise, for the familiar sting of hurt. But it never came. All I felt was a profound, aching sadness for this man who had become so lost in the labyrinth of his own ambition that he could no longer see the truth. He had traded his daughter for a legacy, and in the end, had lost them both. "Callie, I need you," he said finally, his voice cracking. "We're family." That word, family. It used to be a chain that bound me, a word that held the weight of 1,000 unspoken obligations. Now, it just sounded hollow. I took a deep, steadying breath, the silence in my office a stark contrast to the storm that had once raged inside me. I thought of a verse Marcus had shared with me from an old Bible he kept, from Proverbs. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. My heart, for the first time, felt truly my own. It was a quiet, peaceful territory I'd fought hard to secure, and I would not allow it to be invaded again. "Dad," I said, my voice calm and even, "I will always be your daughter, but I can no longer be the lifeline for the consequences of your choices. I can't fix this for you." I paused, letting the words settle. "Unless you are willing to get into therapy to understand why you did what you did, and unless you are willing to issue a public apology, not to me, but to the soldiers whose service you belittled, then there is nothing more for us to talk about." The silence on his end was long and heavy. I could hear his faint, ragged breathing. Then he muttered something under his breath about ingratitude, the last refuge of a man who refuses to see his own reflection. And I gently hung up the phone. There was no anger, no hatred, no satisfying slam of the receiver, just a quiet click. And in that click, I felt a lifetime of chains fall away. I was, finally, free. 6 months later. Time, I've learned, doesn't just heal wounds. It gives you the space to build something new over the scarred ground. We moved out of the city, trading the constant, humming tension of DC for a small, quiet house in the Virginia suburbs. It was far enough away that the political noise faded into a distant murmur, but close enough that I could still hear the faint, familiar sound of the national anthem playing from the nearby base in the evenings. The house had a backyard, a patch of green earth that was entirely ours. I started a rose garden, a task I found surprisingly therapeutic. Tending to the delicate bushes, pruning the dead branches to make way for new growth, required a patience and a gentle hand I was only just beginning to learn how to apply to myself. The Callie Duffy Soldier Support Fund was thriving. It had become more than I ever imagined, a beacon of practical support for hundreds of soldiers and their families. We helped cover medical bills that insurance wouldn't touch, funded mental health counseling with no wait lists, and provided emergency grants for families struggling between deployments. My life found a new, sustainable rhythm. By day, I was Captain Duffy, leading my soldiers with a renewed sense of purpose. I loved my job, loved the camaraderie and the clarity of the mission. But now, when I came home, I wasn't returning to an empty apartment filled with unspoken tensions. I was returning to a sanctuary, to Marcus, to peace. And then, one crisp autumn afternoon, our quiet, peaceful world was filled with an entirely new and unexpected light. After years of our lives being dictated by deployment schedules and family stress, after so many quiet fears that perhaps that chapter was closed to us, the doctor confirmed it. We were going to have a baby. Sitting in that sterile examination room, I cried. Not out of fear or shock, but from a wave of pure, unadulterated happiness, so immense it felt like it could break me open. For so long, I had worried that the scars from my past, the ones etched deep into my soul, would make it impossible for me to build a truly happy family of my own. I was afraid the darkness I had carried would somehow poison the light. But Marcus was there, his arms wrapping around me, his own eyes shining with tears. "We're going to show this baby what a real family is," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "One built on respect, trust, and unconditional love." In the weeks that followed, we started preparing a room, transforming a small empty space into a nursery. One afternoon, we were putting together the final touches. I was carefully hanging a small detailed model of a Black Hawk helicopter from the ceiling, a nod to the life that had shaped me, the world of service I would always be a part of. Marcus was on the other side of the room, hanging a simple, hand-carved wooden star on the wall. He had it custom-made. Burned into the wood was a quote, "Family is where life begins and love never ends." Looking back at the night of the party now, I don't see an ending. I see a violent, necessary beginning. It was the moment I was forced to confront a truth I'd spent a lifetime avoiding. My worth was not and had never been contingent on my father's approval. My value wasn't in my name, or my rank on his roster. It was in my actions. It was in my integrity. It was in the way I led my soldiers and the unwavering loyalty I gave to those who earned it. Marcus didn't save me that night. He simply held up a mirror, reflecting a strength that had been inside me all along, a strength I had been too afraid to see. He showed me that real family isn't about bloodlines. It's about who stands beside you in the trenches. The story ends here, on a perfect Sunday afternoon. The air is warm, filled with the smell of freshly cut grass and the rich, smoky scent of burgers grilling on the back porch. I'm sitting in a comfortable rocking chair, one hand resting on my stomach, feeling the gentle, insistent flutter of a new life getting ready to begin its own journey. Marcus is at the grill, humming a song that's slightly off-key, and the sound is the most beautiful music I've ever heard. In the distance, from the base, the clear final notes of the national anthem drift through the air. I found my legacy. It wasn't on a name card at a head table, it wasn't in a multi-million-dollar fund, and it certainly wasn't in the hollow approval of a broken man. It's right here, in this small house, in this quiet garden, in the unwavering love of my husband. It's in the child we're about to bring into this world. It is in the profound, hard-won peace of a soldier who finally learned how to fight the right battle and how to build a life on the territory she claimed for herself. And it is a life that is, finally, gloriously, my own. My story found its peaceful ending, not because the fighting stopped, but because I finally learned which battles were worth fighting for. It's a peace I truly wish for every one of you. The greatest gift I received was my chosen family. The people who saw my worth when I couldn't see it myself. I'd be honored if you shared one word in the comments that describes your own chosen family. If this story resonated with you, please hit like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us share these messages of strength with others who are still fighting their silent battles. Thank you for listening.